My father-in-law was the one who found me, not my husband, not anyone who should have been looking. It was my father-in-law, my husband's own father, who spotted me walking down Richmond Avenue in 98-degree heat with my 7-month-old strapped to my chest and 4 grocery bags cutting into my palms. He was driving back from the hardware store. He almost didn't recognize me because I had my hair up, and his brain, I think, didn't expect to see me there. On foot. In the middle of the afternoon. Alone. He pulled over so fast his tires made a sound. He rolled down the window and said, "Vivian, what are you doing?" And I didn't know how to answer that, because the real answer was long and humiliating, and I had been holding it together for 45 minutes, and I was genuinely afraid that if I opened my mouth the wrong way, I was going to cry in front of him on a public street with my baby sweating against my chest. So I just said, "I'm walking home from the store." He looked at me. He looked at the bags. He looked at Rosie, who was making that little fussy sound she makes when she's hot and uncomfortable, and he said, "Get in the car." I got in the car. I need to back up because none of this makes sense without the context. And the context is the kind of thing that, when I try to explain it to people who haven't lived it, they always ask the same question. Why did you let it get that far? I don't have a clean answer for that. I have a true one, but it's not clean. My husband. I'll call him my husband because I'm still working through what I want to call him, honestly. His name is Scott. We met when I was 24 and he was 26. We got married 2 years later in a small ceremony in Asheville, North Carolina, which is where I'm from. His family is from outside of Columbus, Ohio. There's his mother, Patrice, his sister, Renee, and his father, Gerald, who is the man who found me on the side of the road. I want to be clear about Gerald right now so you understand what happens later. Gerald is a quiet man. He's the kind of man who fixes things without being asked and doesn't talk about it after. He apologizes when he's wrong. He calls me on my birthday, not just on holidays. He has, in the 3 years Scott and I have been married, treated me like I belong to the family. Not like a guest, not like a problem. Like I belong. Patrice is different. I don't say that to be cruel. I say it because it's the central fact of the last 2 years of my life, and there's no point in softening it. Patrice is the kind of woman who decided within 6 months of our engagement that she didn't like me, and rather than say so directly, she expressed it in 100 small ways that individually sound ridiculous when you try to describe them, but together added up to something that quietly ground me down over time. She'd correct the way I loaded the dishwasher at their house. She'd tell Scott things I'd said and add a half-beat of silence after, the kind that was meant to make him question me. She'd tell me I looked tired in a tone that wasn't concern. She'd ask about my job. I work in medical billing, it's not glamorous. With this particular polite smile that said she thought it wasn't enough. And Renee followed her mother like a shadow. Same expressions, same pauses, same little jabs wrapped in casual conversation. Scott knew his mother was difficult. He said so. He used the word particular. He said she didn't mean anything by it. He said I needed to give her more time. I gave her 2 years. We had moved into our house in March. It's a 3-bedroom ranch in a suburb outside of Columbus, close enough to Scott's family that they could help when the baby came, which had seemed like a good idea when I was pregnant, and still believed that proximity would translate to warmth. Rosie was born in January. She was 7 months old the day this happened. The arrangement we had, and I use the word arrangement loosely because it was less of an agreement and more of a thing that had gradually become assumed, was that Scott would take the car to work on weekdays. We had one car, a 4-year-old Honda Pilot that was in my name because I'd bought it before we got married. He worked 20 minutes away. I worked from home. It made sense, but what also started happening a few months after Rosie was born was that Patrice and Renee would sometimes come by during the day, which was fine, and sometimes they would need to run an errand and they'd ask to borrow the car, which had happened maybe 3 times before that day, always briefly, always with the car back within an hour or 2. The day it happened, I needed to get to the grocery store. We were out of formula, not almost out, actually out. I had given Rosie the last of it that morning. And I needed bread and a few other things, and I had a prescription ready at the pharmacy that I'd been meaning to pick up for a week. I checked the driveway before I called Scott at work. The car was gone. I hadn't been told it would be gone. I texted Scott. He said his mother had needed to take Renee somewhere and she'd asked if she could borrow the car and he'd said yes, and he'd forgotten to tell me. He said sorry with a lowercase s and a period. I remember looking at that text for a long time. I said, okay, when is she bringing it back? He said he wasn't sure, a few hours probably. I looked at Rosie and her bouncer. I looked at the empty formula can on the counter. I called Patrice. She didn't answer. I called Renee. She didn't answer. I called Renee. She didn't answer. I texted both of them. Nothing. I waited an hour. I called Scott again and told him I needed the car back. We were out of formula. This wasn't something I could just wait on. He said he'd try to reach his mother. 20 minutes later, he texted me. She said she'll be done soon. She said you can order delivery if you need something urgently. Delivery. For formula. For a prescription. Using money I didn't have extra of that week because we'd just paid the car insurance. I stood in my kitchen and made a decision I still stand behind, which was that I was going to walk to the grocery store rather than wait for a grown woman to decide my baby's needs were important enough to interrupt whatever she was doing. The store was about 1.25 miles, not far, in good weather. It was 98 degrees. I put Rosie in the carrier on my chest. I put the diaper bag on my back. I walked to the store. I bought the formula and the bread and the other things, and I picked up the prescription, and I paid, and I walked back out into the heat and started for home. I was maybe a third of the way back when Gerald pulled over. He didn't say much in the car. That's how he is. He turned on the air conditioning and asked if Rosie needed anything and handed me a water bottle he had in the cuff holder. I drank half of it in one go. Rosie settled almost immediately once she felt the cold air. When we pulled into my driveway, the Honda was there. Patrice's car was behind it. They were inside. I had not given them a key. The back door. I know I locked it, but the window in the laundry room doesn't close all the way. I'd been meaning to fix it. Scott kept saying he'd take care of it. Was how they'd gotten in, I found out later. I sat in Gerald's car for a moment. I felt very tired in a way that had nothing to do with the walk. Gerald said, "What's going on, Vivian?" It wasn't quite a question the way he said it. It was more like he was telling me he already knew something was wrong, and he was giving me permission to confirm it. So I told him, not everything. I didn't have the words for everything right then. But I told him about the car, about the formula, about the texts, about the 3 hours I'd spent waiting before I gave up and put my baby in a carrier in the heat because no one was answering their phone. He listened to all of it. His hands were on the steering wheel even though we were parked. When I finished, he said, "Does Scott know you walked?" I said I didn't know. I texted him that I was going to the store, but I hadn't told him I was walking. Gerald nodded. He didn't say anything else. He got out of the car. I got out too, and I followed him to the front door, and when I opened it, Patrice and Renee were in my living room. Patrice was on the sofa with her shoes off. Renee was in the kitchen doing something at the counter. They had, at some point in the 3+ hours they had my car, stopped at a drive-thru because there was a fast food bag on my coffee table. Patrice looked up. She saw me. Then she saw Gerald behind me and something in her face shifted. She said, "Oh, we were waiting for you to get back. I was going to put groceries away." I looked at the bags in my hands. I looked at her. I said, "I just got back from the store." She said, "We would have taken you, honey. You just needed to ask." And that one sentence was the thing that finally broke the seal on whatever I'd been keeping tamped down for 2 years. Because it was so perfectly crafted to rewrite reality, to make me the one who had failed to communicate, to make the problem my failure to ask, as though I hadn't called, as though I hadn't texted, as though the car was a communal resource that she was generously allowing me to petition for rather than property that was in my name that she had taken without telling me while my infant daughter had nothing to eat. I said, "I did call. I called both of you. I texted both of you. Neither of you answered. She started to say something. Gerald said, "Patrice." She stopped. He said, "Vivian walked to the store. In this heat. With the baby. Because the car was gone and no one picked up the phone." The room changed. I can't explain it more specifically than that. The room just changed. Renee came out of the kitchen. She looked at her mother. Patrice looked at Gerald. Nobody looked at me for a moment. Then Patrice said, "Well, I didn't know she needed the car today." Gerald said, "It's her car." 3 words. That was it. "It's her car." 3 words. That was it. It's her car. I had been waiting, without knowing it, for someone in this family to say that for 2 years. Not Scott. Not a therapist. Not a conversation I rehearsed in the shower. Gerald, standing in my living room with his arms at his sides, saying 3 words in a tone that had no anger in it, just fact. Patrice opened her mouth. Gerald said, "We're going to go. Vivian needs to get the baby settled." He called Scott on the way out. I heard part of it through the screen door, which I had left slightly open while I got Rosie out of the carrier and gave her a bottle. Gerald's voice was low and I couldn't hear the words, but I could hear the steadiness of it. The way it didn't rise. Scott came home 40 minutes later. Rosie was asleep. I was at the kitchen table with a glass of water and the grocery receipt, which I don't know why I was looking at. I just needed something to do with my hands. He stood in the doorway for a second. He said, "Dad called me." I said, "I know." He came and sat across from me. I could tell he had been thinking in the car, working something out or working up to something. He said, "I should have told you she was taking the car. That was wrong." I said, "Yes." He said, "And I should have done more when you said you needed it back. I know that." I looked at him. He meant it. I could tell he meant it. And I had married him because he was, at his core, someone who knew how to mean things. But meaning something and doing something are 2 different architectures, and I had spent 2 years watching the gap between them widen. I said, "Scott, I walked a mile and a half in 98-degree heat with your daughter because your mother took my car and didn't answer her phone. That's what happened today." He said, "I know." I said, "Your father found me on the side of the road." He said, "I know." He told me. I said, "I need you to understand that this isn't about one day. This is about a pattern. And I need to know if you see that, or if we're going to keep having smaller versions of this conversation forever." He didn't answer right away. That used to scare me, his pauses. I used to fill them. I had learned slowly to sit in them. He said, "I see it." I said, "What are you going to do about it?" I want to tell you that Scott had a perfect, immediate answer, that he said exactly the right thing, that everything pivoted cleanly in that moment. That's not what happened. What happened was messier and slower and more human. But here's what did happen. In the weeks after, Gerald came by 2 days later just to check on us, the way he does. He fixed the laundry room window. He didn't make a thing of it. He just fixed it. Scott had a conversation with his mother. I was not in the room for it. I don't know everything that was said. But Patrice did not come to our house unannounced after that. She didn't borrow the car again. She didn't stop being herself entirely. She's still who she is, and she still gives me that particular smile sometimes. And there are still dinners where I feel like a piece of furniture in my own life. But something shifted. A line had been drawn and it held. And Scott started doing a thing he hadn't done before, which was small, but which meant more to me than I knew how to say at the time. When his mother said something at dinner that was pointed, he responded. Not harshly, not dramatically. He just didn't let it land in silence anymore. It's not a perfect ending. I don't have one of those. What I have is a husband who is trying, and a father-in-law who, on a Tuesday afternoon in August, drove past me on Ridgemont Avenue and pulled over without having to think about it, and a daughter who doesn't know any of this yet, who was just hot and hungry and immediately calmed down the second air conditioning hit her face, the way babies do, completely in the present moment, completely unaware of everything that was quietly falling apart and quietly beginning to be repaired around her. Some days that's enough. Some days I'm still working on believing that. But I'm here, and the car is in the driveway, and it has my name on the title. That part hasn't changed. I've thought a lot about what it actually takes for things to change. Not the dramatic kind of change, not the slam doors and ultimatums that make for a satisfying ending in a movie. The real kind, the kind that happens slowly, in the gaps between conversations, in the moments where someone either speaks or doesn't. What I keep coming back to is Gerald on that sidewalk. The fact that he pulled over. It sounds simple, but I don't think it was. He didn't have to get involved. He could have told himself it wasn't his business. He could have driven by, thought about it, and convinced himself it was a family thing, and family things work themselves out. A lot of people would have done exactly that. Instead, he pulled over and handed me a water bottle and listened. That's what I mean when I talk about integrity now. Not a grand speech, not a dramatic confrontation. Just a person who saw something wrong and did the small, immediate thing. Because he was that kind of man, not because anyone was watching, not because there was any reward in it. Rosie was out of the heat within 10 minutes. That's the math of small, decent choices. They add up to something real. And then there's Scott. I've been hard on Scott in this story because I needed to be honest about what those 2 years felt like. But I want to say something true about him too, which is that when his father called him, he came home. He didn't defend his mother. He didn't minimize. He sat across from me at the kitchen table and said, I know when I needed him to say it. That's not nothing. That's actually the beginning of something, if a person is willing to follow through on it. Willingness isn't the same as action, but it's where action has to start. What I learned, not from one day, but from everything that led up to it and followed it, is that silence is never neutral. Every time I didn't say something because I didn't want to cause conflict, I was making a choice. Every time Scott let a comment land without responding, he was making a choice too. We both thought we were keeping the peace. What we were actually doing was letting something grow that eventually sent me out into 98-degree heat with a 7-month-old because I had no other option. Strength isn't about confrontation. It isn't about being loud or demanding or refusing to compromise. It's about knowing what is yours. Your car, your home, your right to be treated as a full person in your own life, and being willing to say so clearly, calmly, without apology. I had the strength in me all along. I just kept talking myself out of using it. Rosie won't remember that afternoon. She was too young. She just remembers, in whatever wordless way babies remember things, that the air got cool and someone held her and she was okay. I want that for her for the rest of her life. Not that nothing hard will ever happen, but that there will always be someone who pulls over. And I want her to be that person for herself, before she needs someone else to be it for her. I'm still learning how to be that person. Some days I'm better at it than others, but I know what it looks like now. I saw it in a parking lot on a Tuesday in August, and I haven't forgotten it.